I will. Gotcha.
Ready to go? Okay, I am Bob Ullrich, not Ullrich, not whatever he called me. And this is John Kleber over here, actually in German, John Kleber. The idea for this presentation came about a year ago when John and I attended a presentation on Bloody Monday. And we remarked to each other, every one of these that we see is different. all having different slants, all blaming it on somebody different. But all of them, or at least 90% of them, focus only on what happened on that day, August 6, 1855. And also August 6, Steve, is the anniversary of the atomic bomb drop in 1945.
Interesting.
I'm going to switch hands here. Need to again, keep control of this rascal here. So we decided that we want to talk about all that led up to Bloody Monday happening. And then, after having presented that, I think you can figure out what happened. So this is called Bloody Monday, Causes and Aftermath. And a lot of the material for this presentation came from these two books, which my wife and I edited with great assistance from John Kleber. We never would have made it without you, John. But John wrote a couple chapters, three chapters in these two books. And there's a lot to be said about Bloody Monday in these two books. There's also more information that is cranked into this talk today. So without going any further, make sure everybody knows exactly what we're talking about. What is Bloody Monday? Bloody Monday refers to the ethnic riots that occurred in Louisville on August 6, 1855, which was an election day for governor of Kentucky and members of the U.S. House of Representatives. And on that day, German and Irish immigrants who were attempting to vote were beaten and shot in the name of America or Americans. Sound familiar? The day was one of the darkest in Louisville history. Now, in our view, John and I, there were many causes for Bloody Monday. Not one single cause, but many causes. And probably the overwhelming cause was immigration. To be exact, too much immigration all at once. And we'll see about that. This is a map of Louisville in 1832. And if I had three hands, I could show you the boundaries of where Louisville was. I think I can do a pretty good job here. Southern boundary of the city was right here. It's called Prather Street. We now know it as Broadway. In the west, Baxter, and on the other side, about 12th Street. Of course, on the north is the Ohio River, and then you see this stream that's running through the city and into the Ohio River. That was Beargrass Creek. Beargrass Creek ran into the Ohio River at the foot of 4th Street all the way up until 1855 when it was rerouted in Butchertown, and that's where it flows in today. As you can imagine, as the city developed, that creek became an open sewer very quickly. So they wanted to get it out of the city, and that's what they did. Louisville had about 10,000 people in 1832. Hell, you got 10,000 people in Shively now. But in the 1832 city directory, there were only 25 German-born residents of Louisville, only 25. The first one came in 1817 and took all the way up to 1832 to get 24 more. There were a few Irish immigrants who were living in Louisville. hard to identify them by name because they have less distinctive names than Germans do. There was only one Catholic church in Louisville at this time, a tiny church at 10th and Water Streets. And you're saying, Water Street, where was that? Well, it ran along the Ohio River. That's where it was. It's called Water Street. It's no longer there. So, would you believe it if I told you that by 1840, there were 4,000 German immigrants living in Louisville? From 1832 to 1840, 4,000. So many that the Roman Catholic Diocese of Louisville moved its seat from Bardstown to Louisville in 1841. Here are the causes of the Germans coming. Following the Napoleonic Wars, there was a conference called the Conference of Vienna, and the Conference of Vienna established the German Confederation, 1815. The map there sort of looks like Germany, but not exactly. What that map is, it shows 39, thank you, 39 separate kingdoms, duchies, free states, and other principalities all slammed together into what was called the German Confederation. They had nothing in common other than they all spoke German, and very little else. They fought each other routinely. They all had different state religions. They all had different economic systems. And as you can imagine, this so-called German Confederation didn't take long before going into economic despair. So in the 1830s, it hit bad economic times, and the natives of these states started looking around and saying to each other, there's nothing for me here. The prices are high, can't buy any land. My brother's going to inherit all the land, I'm not going to get any. So what did they look to do? Well, they looked to immigrate, mostly to the United States. And so when they got to the United States, to the ports, mainly on the East Coast, they sought to move into the interior of the country where the land was. And how did they get there? No interstate system in 1832, 1830s. No jet airplanes, for sure. But there's the rivers. So they came in along the rivers and along the Great Lakes, and they settled at places like Louisville, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Quad Cities, keep on going, along the Great Lakes, Cleveland, Chicago, Milwaukee. All of those places have, today even, heavy German ancestry among their populations. And in Louisville, 1/3 of the population of Louisville can claim German ancestry. So you see the wharf in Portland. The Falls of the Ohio was an obstruction to navigation in 1850, in the 1850s, 1830s, I guess we're talking about the immigration coming in. And the boats had to stop there. Anybody who wanted to go upstream had a portage around the falls and get back on another boat at the foot of 4th Street and continue on. Well, what happened was a lot of them got off and never got back on another boat. They just stayed here. The same thing for people going downstream. They just got off at 4th Street and never quite made it to Portland. So Louisville has very strong German history because of that. Now, the Irish, on the other hand, their immigration was heavily impacted by the potato blight of 1846. Western Europe was hit with the potato blight in 1846. It totally wiped out the potato crops in that year. And that was of no matter to the countries on the continent because they were agriculturally diversified. They had other crops that they could survive on. They really didn't need the potato. But the Irish, that's all they had was the potato. They grew potatoes, they ate potatoes, breakfast, lunch, dinner, every day of the week. And when my potatoes go bad, I'm in trouble. So you can see the poor woman with her 2 children. What do you do when you can't get food for your family? Well, you go out and you find it somewhere, even if you had to steal it. Some of the cities had what were called food riots, where stores like bakeries were ransacked and people ran away with loaves of bread and everything else, something to eat. A lot of the Irish living along the seacoast ate seaweed to subsist. They ate grass. They ate shoe leather, anything. And they died. Most of all, they died. 1.5 billion Irish out of a population of 8 million died. And another 1 million immigrated. That's 2.5 out of 8 million. Even today, the population of Ireland, including Northern Ireland, is only 7 million. They still haven't made it back to pre-famine levels. The map on the right is showing the decline in population from 1841 to 1851, and only these tiny areas in green, here, here, and here, had a population increase. Every other area had a population decrease, and the ones that had the greatest decrease, the darkest red, tend to be on the west. The west was heavily impacted by the famine. So this summarizes all of it. Data that we got from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, that from 1820, when records were first kept about such things, to 1860, basically all the way up to the Civil War, there were about 1.5 million Germans that came to the United States, and about 2 million Irish, mainly fueled by the famine. From the Civil War up until 1920, about the time of World War I, sounded like I lost my sound. 4 million Germans came from 1860 to 1920, about 2.5 million Irish, so you see the Irish are losing their enthusiasm. From 1920 to 2010, basically the last 100 years, 1.8 million Germans, but less than 500,000 Irish. The large number of Germans mainly are refugees from World War I and World War II. So in total, from 1820 to 1910, we could just round that off and say up until today, more than 7 million Germans have come to the United States, and a little bit less than 5 million Irish. The 2 largest ethnic populations to come to Louisville. So how about Louisville? Going back in the census data, when people were identified by name and where they came from for the first time in 1850, we could count up the number of people who say that they were Germans and the number of people who say that they were Irish, and do that in every census all the way up to 1910. And the red dots represent the Germans and the green dots represent the Irish. So pretty much steadily, there were twice as many Germans in Louisville than Irish. Now, hang on to that thought because we'll go back and use that in a little bit. This is a map of Louisville in 1855. The different colors on the map are the different voting wards of the city. And the first 3 wards, the pink, the yellow, and the green here, is where the Germans lived. It's an area of the city that's east of downtown. It was called Uptown at that time. We now know it as Phoenix Hill. But the Germans lived in Uptown, the voting wards 1, 2, and 3. The Irish lived in the west of downtown, Ward 7 and Ward 8. Now, in 1855, Germans represented 1/3 of the population of Louisville. Just think about that. In 1832, there were only 25 Germans. 1855, it's 1/3 of the population of Louisville. That's big. On the other side of the city, the Irish represented half as many as the Germans. Well, half of 1/3 is 1/6, right? So you got 1/3. You put the Germans and the Irish together, and you've got immigrants occupying half the population of the city. Now, what about Catholics? Okay, the Germans were half Catholic. Not one person being half Catholic, but every other person was Catholic. Okay, so half of the Germans were Catholic, all of the Irish were Catholic, and if you figure out the fractions of that, you come up with Louisville having a population that's 1/3 Catholic. All right, practically no Catholics in Louisville in 1832. Now, Catholics were suspect by the general population in those days. The general population of people, the non-immigrants, thought that Catholics could not be trusted because they obeyed anything that the Pope told them. Pope hadn't called me lately and told me what to do. If he did, I'd tell him I'm going to go do whatever I want. So, but that's what they thought back then. And a ward of the city is an area where you have one representative that's on the city council. So 8 wards means 8 members on the city council. And 8 wards means there is one place in each ward where you can go and vote. Okay, hang on to that. Hope I'm not giving you too much to hang on to. Okay, the second element in the mix of Bloody Monday were a group of people known as the 48ers. They were not a football team. They were people who came to the United States in 1848. So what happened in 1848? Well, people living in the German Confederation, which still was not unified, saw France and England prospering while the German Confederation floundered, and they wanted to have a unified country so that they could enjoy the same sort of lifestyle that the French and the English were. So they wanted to take it into their own hands and unify the country. And so the educated and the free-thinking people of Germany got together and they formed a parliament in Frankfurt. And you see that picture down here on the right. They even drew up a constitution for a new government. And they could have pulled it off if they had had the support of the Prussian army, but they did not. The Prussian army was against it. So the revolution failed, and you know what happens to the losers in a revolution. They have to hightail it out for their own lives. And there were a lot of 48ers who came to the United States in 1848. I divided the 48ers into 3 groups. I call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. These are 2 of the good guys. Carl Schurz fled the revolution by the skin of his teeth, settled in St. Louis, became a general in the almost said Revolutionary War, Civil War. Later was a senator, U.S. Senator from Missouri, and was Secretary of the Interior. I'm going to say I may have the wrong office, but he was in the Benjamin Harrison administration. He was in the cabinet of Benjamin Harrison. The guy on the right is Albert Fink, who was a structural engineer. And Albert Fink fled the country in 1848, went to Baltimore, and he went to work for the B&O Railroad designing bridges. In 1850, James Guthrie started the L&N Railroad, and he needed a bridge engineer. So he snatched up Albert Fink and brought him to Louisville. Albert Fink designed a number of notable bridges, one of which was the Green River Bridge. There are only depictions of it existing today. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by the Confederates during the Civil War. But another more important bridge that he designed was the first bridge across the Ohio River at Louisville, the one across the falls of the Ohio River. That bridge is not there today, but the piers of the bridge, the support columns of the bridge are still there. Many of them have been removed. There were 26 spans to that bridge, which was made of iron. And because it had so many spans, it was an obstruction to river traffic, and the people in Cincinnati thought it was a ploy by the L&N Railroad to steal all their business. But it was really a boon to the L&N Railroad because it opened markets to the north of the Ohio River to the railroad. Now, these guys, I couldn't call them bad guys, but they're not as good as the first two. The Turners. Anybody in this room have family that used to belong to Turners or may still? Yeah, a lot of people do usually. The Turners, the word Turner means gymnast in German, and a Turnverein, as you see here, a Turnverein, the Louisville Turnverein, is a gymnastics club. So there were a lot of Turnvereins around the country. The first one was formed in Cincinnati in 1848, then the one in Louisville in 1850. Turner Hall, which is their meeting place, has bounced around, but one location of it was here, which is at Floyd and Broadway, which is an historic house. It's the former boyhood home of Louis Brandeis. Now they're down on River Road, and probably if you went in there and questioned them if they knew anything about the history of the Turners as an organization, if you told them the Turners used to be German, they'd be shocked. How quickly they forget. Okay, the ugly guys are newspaper editors. From top to bottom, newspaper editors are ugly guys. Probably the ugliest was a man named Carl Peter Heinzen. Heinzen was thrown out of Germany no less than 3 times for creating trouble. Of course, he heard there was a revolution going on there in 1848, so he got back in time to participate himself. And then he had to get out again, and he came to Louisville, and he and his associate, Bernhard Damschke, founded a newspaper called The Pioneer. And in 1854, The Pioneer published a manifesto called the Louisville Platform. The preamble to the Louisville Platform read, and I'm paraphrasing this, there are a lot of us here now, meaning German immigrants. We ought to start throwing our weight around and getting what we want. It's kind of a heavy-handed approach to things. So they identified a number of points, things that they thought needed fixing in the American government. And of course, the people who had been here a long time thought it was presumptuous of these foreigners to walk in and just be here a few years and they want to rearrange everything. But in the platform, they were saying that slavery should be abolished, sitting here in Louisville, which was in a slave state at that time. Every religious coercion is illegal. That was pointed at the Pope, trying to tell all the Catholics what to do. Things must have been different back then. Women should have equal rights with men. Unheard of. Equal standing of all colored people with equal standing of the free colored with all people. Abolition of the death penalty. Temperance laws should not interfere with the individual's right to privacy. In other words, you can drink in the privacy of your own home. And don't tell me if I can't do that. So the Louisville Platform was printed in at least 27 German language newspapers as far away as San Antonio, and was approved by German societies in different areas. In Louisville, the Germans, the ordinary Germans living in Louisville, thought it was extreme because there was already a tenuous relationship between the immigrants and the non-immigrants. Now, I'm going to quit saying non-immigrants, and I'm going to call them nativists. That means that they were here before the immigrants came. So just giving you a lot to keep in your mind, but the nativist refers to the non-immigrant. So the nativist and the immigrants had a tenuous relationship. The immigrants knew that, and they wanted to tread lightly and not cause any trouble. And they viewed the Louisville platform as making trouble, which it did make trouble. There's a lot of offense that was taken to it by newspapers in Louisville. So the year 1855, well, you knew this man was coming. George Dennison Prentice came to Kentucky in the early 1830s. He was from Connecticut, and he came here to support the presidential campaign of Henry Clay. Henry Clay was a Whig, member of the Whig Party, a conservative party, and Prentice was the biggest fan of the Whigs. He's a huge Whig fan. So he came here to help Henry Clay. He even wrote a book about Henry Clay during the campaign. But Clay ended up losing the election. And in the meantime, Prentice met a woman that he liked in Louisville, and they got married, and he settled down here. And Prentice, along with several other people, started a newspaper called the Louisville Daily Journal. Prentice was the editor of the Daily Journal, and he was famous or notorious, however you want to view it, for championing his side of any issue and vilifying whoever was on the other side. So if there was a Whig running for election in a particular election, Prentice would be right up front, just pumping up the candidate and saying he's the greatest thing who ever lived, you ought to vote for him. And at the same time tearing down his opponent, saying everything that he could say dirty about the opponent so as to try to influence the election. Now, unfortunately for Prentice, unfortunately for everybody, I guess, in the early 1850s, the Whig Party collapsed. There was no more Whig Party for Prentice to support. So he went casting about for another party to support. And in the early 1850s, another conservative party popped up called the American Party. You could see written on the flag pretty much get a sense of what the American Party was about. It says Native Americans, beware of foreign influence. In other words, immigrants go away, Catholics go away twice. And so Prentice hitched his wagon to the American Party. Now, before I get off this slide and forget about it, the American Party was secretive about its beliefs. And if you question one of them about what they believed, they would say, I know nothing. And so they became known as the Know-Nothings. So we're going to forget about American Party. These are the Know-Nothings. I should have distributed a little booklet of definitions here. Okay, in April of 1855, there was an election for mayor of Louisville. James Speed, not to be confused with the James Speed who was friend of Lincoln, a different James Speed. James S. Speed, was the mayor of Louisville. He was the incumbent. He was running for re-election. And his opponent was John Barbee, who was a know-nothing. Now, it so happened that Speed's wife was Catholic. So Prentice turned on him and said every mean thing that he could possibly dream of, and pumped up Barbee at the same time, and Barbee won the election. Not only did Barbee win the election as a know-nothing, But all of the members of the city council who were elected then were know-nothings. So the entire city was controlled by the know-nothings. In August of 1855, there was an election. That's the one that we're here to talk about. And in that election, there were candidates for governor of the state of Kentucky and representatives of the U.S. House of Representatives. Okay, and the representative of the third district was Warner Underwood. He was a know-nothing. Charles Moorhead was the know-nothing candidate for governor. Now, the know-nothings wanted to make damn sure that they won the election. And they knew that no self-respecting immigrant would ever vote for a know-nothing candidate. So they had to fix things. And they fixed it by giving yellow cards to all the members of the American Party. Only those would get yellow cards, and when they showed up at the voting polls, they could sail right through because they had a yellow card that permitted them to vote. The immigrants were not allowed. They weren't getting the yellow cards. It was refused to give a yellow card to the immigrants. Now the immigrants, among the immigrants, only those who had been naturalized were allowed to vote. That's the way it is today. You have to be a naturalized citizen to vote. And only the men were allowed to vote. So only naturalized men on both sides of the issue were allowed to vote. Since the government of Louisville was controlled by know-nothings, and the know-nothings had a strong interest in the election, the know-nothings manned all of the voting polls. And they posted what could only be called thugs at the entrance to the voting polls to, quote, keep order. Now, on the day of August 6, 1855, the Louisville Journal came out, and in that issue of the Louisville Journal, Prentice wrote this. He said, "Let the foreigners keep their elbows to themselves today at the polls. Americans, are you ready? We think we hear you shout ready. Well, fire. And may heaven have mercy on the foe." So that could be called inciting a riot. So election day, August 6, 1855. The polls opened at 6 o'clock in the morning, just like they do today. And it didn't take long for tensions to develop. People of the American Party would show up with their yellow cards. They would just sail right through and vote. When the immigrants showed up, they were stalled and held off. Let me see your papers. These papers don't look quite right. Do you know that you're actually naturalized? Do you live here in Louisville? Can you prove that? And on it went. And the line kept building up and building up. People were getting impatient. It's in August. You know what the weather's like in August. It's always been that way in Louisville. So tensions developed and brawls broke out. There was fighting. There were beatings. But at about 9 o'clock, as they say, a shot was fired. Somebody fired a shot at a passing carriage, and when the shot was heard, all hell broke loose. It wasn't about an election anymore. It was about hatred on the part of the nativists toward the immigrants. The nativists had been itching to get at the immigrants for a hell of a long time, and they were looking for the right opportunity, and here it was. Word of the fighting and shooting got downtown very quickly to the courthouse lawn, and a mob formed spontaneously at the courthouse lawn, and they went charging east on Jefferson Street, towing the cannon from the courthouse yard along with them. guess they hitched it up to a team of horses, towed it along, and shouting all the way, "Kill the Dutch," meaning the Germans. On the left there you see a rendition of rioting on Shelby Street. In those days, Shelby Street was the main drag through the German neighborhood. Wouldn't look out, get my directions that way, and think of Shelby Street as being the main drag through anywhere. But in those days, it was the main drag through the German neighborhood, and it went straight through from Main Street to Broadway. There wasn't any of this, whatever monkeying around they did with Shelby Street down here, rearranging the route of Shelby Street. It was a straight route all the way through. There were all these businesses along Shelby Street. That was where you would go to shop and buy groceries and everything else. And the rioting started at the first ward pole, which was at Shelby and Green Street. Green Street we now call Liberty. So I'll be using that, I'll give you another thing to remember. Green Street is now called Liberty. Changed during the First World War. So you see the rioting, a depiction of the rioting there. People were beaten, they were shot, stabbed, everything else. Businesses were broken into and ransacked, and most of the proprietors of these businesses lived upstairs over the businesses. Their apartments were broken into and ransacked. If anybody opposed the mob, they were in danger of beating or even being shot. So this is a smart man on the right here. Conrad Kistler immigrated to the United States in 1850 and opened a grocery at the corner of Shelby and Walnut. You all know that Walnut is now named Muhammad Ali, right? Okay. So Conrad Kistler had a grocery there, and there was a recollection of him sitting in a chair next to the door to his business while all of the rioting was going on, calmly smoking his pipe and drinking his beer while his grocery was broken into and ransacked, and his people broke into his apartment above and took everything that he owned. I guess that he knew that if he opposed it, he would have no hope. So he survived Bloody Monday, rebuilt his business, and stayed in business until sometime in the 1870s. Now, you all know this place on the left here, St. Martin's Church in 1870. About 11 o'clock in the morning, the mob arrived at the entrance to St. Martin's Church and found the doors locked. The mob thought that Catholics had stored firearms inside of the building, and they wanted to get inside the building to confiscate the firearms, weapons that were being used against them. So they had a cannon lined up there, and they were ready to blow the doors down to get into the building. And who should pop up and stand in the way but Mayor Barbee. Mayor Barbee said, "You will have to kill me first before you destroy this building." So Barbee went to the pastor of St. Martin's at the time, the very first pastors, Father Straber, Leander Straber, and Father Straber took the mayor all through the building. They didn't find any firearms. He came back out, he told the mob, "There's nothing in here, break up, go home, stop destroying everything." Of course, you know they didn't. What they did was they went east of St. Martin's Church and worked their way back to the north toward the Ohio River, going through those neighborhoods and ransacking and burning and beating people. And so at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they showed up in the neighborhood of St. Vincent Orphanage at Jefferson and Wenzel. St. Vincent Orphanage was on the south side of Jefferson Street, right at the corner with Wenzel. It's no longer there. but it was run by the Sisters of Charity. And Germans who were fleeing the rioting came to the doors, and the sisters were taking them inside to shelter them. Of course, the mob coming up right behind wanted to get in and get at them, and the nuns stood there in the way. Now, if you've ever been face down by a nun, it is a fearsome thing to be face down by a nun. So the nuns held their ground, and the rioters went away. But I can tell you, I don't want to talk about St. Vincent Orphanage. I want to talk about what's behind it, which unfortunately I can't find a photograph of. I can't find a photograph of the man who owned it. I can't find any of his advertising. It was Armbruster's Brewery. Armbruster's Brewery was on the north side of Green Street, Liberty Street, right? On the north side of Green Street at Wenzel. So the brewery and the nuns shared a backyard fence, which I'm sure came in very handy to the nuns. It's an orphanage, remember? You need something to settle your nerves down at the end of the day. So the mob on the other side, coming up to Armbruster's Brewery, thought that they were being fired upon by people inside the brewery trying to give cover to Germans running into the brewery to take shelter. So the mob decided to attack the brewery and burn it. That was the way that this affair was approached. If anybody offers any opposition to you coming in, you just set fire to the place. So they were going to set fire to the brewery, but they thought, hold off, there might be something good to drink inside. So they went inside the brewery, and what they found, because it was summertime, and you cannot brew beer in the summertime without refrigeration. And of course, this is August in Louisville. So what the breweries did in Louisville back in those days is they made something else in the summer other than beer. And at Armbruster's, what they were making was peach schnapps. So the mob got into the brewery and they drank all of the peach schnapps that was stored there. And then they went outside and set fire to it. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Armbruster lived on the premises. They had an apartment on the premises. Mr. Armbruster was out of town. Mrs. Armbruster, who had 3 small children, wanted to get out of the house, of course, because the place was burning down. Before she did, though, she sewed all of her jewelry into her skirt and stuffed, how much was it, Vicki? $13,000 down her blouse. $1,300, I'm sorry. $1,300 down her blouse. When she got outside of the building, people recognized her, and of course they assaulted her, and I hope her dignity didn't get hurt because she lost that $1,300. I was curious to know how much $1,300 in 1855 represents in today's money. $42,000. A lot of money that woman was carrying on her. She got away, probably a little bruised up, her dress was ripped or whatever. But Armbruster's Brewery went down in flames. Now, this whole affair ended up about 5 o'clock, and so the mob decided, well, let's go help out our brethren in the West assaulting the Irish. So they headed west on Jefferson Street, and as they went west on Jefferson Street, they would have passed the Jefferson County Courthouse. Now, James Speed, the former mayor, had an office inside of the courthouse, and he could watch everything that was going on. And he sat there all day. He was just must have been glued to the window, watching what was going on outside, and watching the cannon go away and then come back, going somewhere else, and fights on the courthouse lawn. He even wrote about a man being run through with a pitchfork on the courthouse lawn. Well, when the mob got to the Irish neighborhoods, they found that the Irish were doing very well, thank you. The Irish had been fighting the know-nothings all day long, and And they had a strategy. They said, well, if we can't beat them, let's fight them with guns. I'll go inside the house, stick my gun out the second-story window, and fire on them. Well, of course, what the mob did, they burned the house. So very quickly, almost everything in the Irish neighborhoods was on fire because of the tactic of the nativists to burn down houses. The man on the left is Father Karl Boswald. He's the pastor of the German Catholic Church, St. Mary's, and known by a variety of names, right, Tim? That was at 8th and Grayson Street, and he was going out to attend to an injured parishioner, and he was caught in a hail of stones being thrown at him. Picked up a number of injuries, limped his way back to the rectory at St. Mary's, and carried on trying to heal up after Bloody Monday occurred. But there's one particular injury that he had to his hip, and an abscess developed on his hip, and he ended up dying in November of 1855. Now, on the right here is the very first St. Patrick Church, the one that preceded the church that you now see at 13th and Market Streets. The pastor of the church was Thomas Joyce, and he decided not to make himself too identifiable. He dressed in street clothes so as to blend in, and went out to come to the aid of one of his injured parishioners. But he was recognized, and the mob strung him up from a street pole, and very luckily some of his parishioners recognized what was going on. They cut him down, otherwise he would have died like Father Boswell. About 7 o'clock in the evening, the mob was approaching a row of tenement houses on the north side of Main Street between 10th and 11th. The row of houses, there were 12 houses between 10th Street and 11th Street. They were all owned by an Irishman named Francis Quinn. And the row of houses was called Quinn's Row. And Irishmen were fleeing the mob and running into Quinn's Row for refuge. And there were Irish up on the second floor of Quinn's Row firing to give them cover as they ran toward the tenement houses to get in and get out of the fighting. Well, you know what happens when gunfire comes from a house, you set fire to it. So they set fire to it with everybody in there. And the fire department showed up, strung out their hoses, and they were told, if you dare spray a drop of water on this fire, we will cut your hoses to shreds. So no water made it onto that fire. Women and children were on the second floor in the windows screaming for help. And they were left in there to die by fire. It took days to clean up Quinn's Row, to clean up the mess from Quinn's Row and get all of the bodies out of there. They were brought to the courthouse lawn and laid out on the courthouse lawn, just like trophies of war. A horrible thing. So Quinn's Row was essentially the end of the heavy fighting on that day. There was still sporadic fighting during the night, and even for days after Bloody Monday. But let's talk about what happened after Bloody Monday. Can you imagine, as a citizen of Louisville, waking up the day after Bloody Monday and looking out the window? You must have thought you had a hell of a hangover looking at that. What have we done to ourselves, they must have thought, because of all of the destruction. The Louisville Anzeiger, the German language newspaper, wrote that 2 days after Bloody Monday, because they published their paper every 2 days, death and waste is everywhere around here. The heat oppresses. It's August. The deathly still inactivity disheartened. And if a citizen goes out, he has before all other business to remember to arm himself to go through the streets unhurt, in the land of the free and brave, in the land of enlightened people in quotes. There are 22 people known to be killed in the riots. The best list that anybody could come up with is this list, which if you count the names very carefully, there are 23. But it is always written that this is a list of 22. Now, Vicki and I have some theories about why, but there are actually 23 people on this list. Certainly there were more. It was not required in those days to report a death. You could simply take somebody out and bury him. That was it. They would remain unknown if they died. So certainly it was more than 22. The Roman Catholic Bishop of Louisville, Martin Spalding, wrote that certainly it must have been in the hundreds. That's enough of a consequence to pay, but there was more. There was extensive damage that was done to homes and businesses in both German and Irish neighborhoods. Thousands of immigrants, and this still the number 1,000, some estimate it's only a few hundred, some say it was tens of thousands, but I'm just going for the middle here and saying thousands. Thousands of immigrants packed up and left Louisville for good. Many of them resettled in other Midwestern cities like St. Louis or Chicago. Some went over to southern Indiana near St. Margaret and tried their hand at farming. There was even one large immigrant group that left in 1856 and went to Prairie City, Kansas, where they found themselves in the middle of the bloody Kansas riots. Bad choice of places to go. Many immigrants who left Louisville, and even those who stayed, wrote letters home telling friends and family not to come to Louisville, that it was not a friendly place to settle. Only the Civil War, with the trade and commerce that it brought, halted this trend. And think about what happened. All of these businesses in the neighborhoods that were destroyed, they were lost. Proprietors couldn't go in the next day and reopen these businesses. People who patronized these businesses had to look for somewhere else to go. And some of the other places to go were having their own problems because so many people moved away. They didn't have enough people coming in to make their business run. So the economy of Louisville just went into the tank after Bloody Monday. And as the last line says, only the Civil War, with the business it brought, saved Louisville. Did this happen in other places? Yes, it did. It happened in Cincinnati, but in Cincinnati, the Germans outnumbered those who were coming at them. And they were armed too, so no trouble there. Also in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Hoboken, Boston, Massachusetts, even in Maine, these riots broke out. So it was not just Louisville. So the Civil War came along, and the German immigrants and the Irish immigrants did themselves well in the Civil War. They represented the United States, meaning the Union, cause very well. It's a photograph on the left of the 20th New York Turner's Rifles Regiment. The regiment was composed not only of all Germans, but they were all Turners, 48ers. Now on the right is a monument to the Irish Brigade in Gettysburg. A brigade consists of 6 or perhaps 7 regiments, a very large group of people. These were all Irish who fought in practically every major campaign in the Civil War. And believe it or not, Louisville elected a mayor in 1865 who was a German immigrant, Philip Tompert. So what happened in the election of August 1855? Well, the Know Nothings won. What happened to the Know Nothing Party? It dissolved in 1857, was supplanted by the Republican Party, and a Republican candidate won the presidency in 1860. So the Know-Nothings weren't around for a long time, but the short time they were, they caused a lot of trouble. Now, on West Main Street, there is a historical marker dedicated to Bloody Monday. On one side, it tells all about Bloody Monday. On the other side, it tells all about the American Party and the Know-Nothings. My wife, this beautiful woman, got together, and she's dressed in her German garb. She's not Irish at all. She got the German American Club hooked up with the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and between the two, they were able to erect this historical marker to Bloody Monday. It is on Main Street between 10th and 11th on the north side. What was there before? Quinn's Road. Okay, it's at the site of Quinn's Road. Now, if you went there today, what is on the north side of Main Street between 10th and 11th? Does anybody know?
Yeah, it's a lottery.
Kentucky Lottery Building. The lottery people were just gaga over having this done. They thought it was the greatest thing that ever came down the road. And Arch Gleason, who at the time was running the lottery, just got in right behind it, wanted to help Vicki and me by inference, because anything she does I have to help, including housework. But they were very, very helpful, very nice people. That was dedicated in 2006. 151 years after Bloody Monday. Incidentally, in August of 1955, 2005, get all of my years wrong, the 150th anniversary of Bloody Monday, there was a huge commemoration for Bloody Monday downtown at Louisville Gardens and at the cathedral, with bus rides all around town to see where everything happened, even if none of the original sites are there anymore, but you can see what happened wherever. Some places are still there. This place is still here. And then we also had a gigantic celebration afterwards at the German American Club featuring Irish step dancers. So, let's see. Book sales. What about books? Remember those two books I showed you in the beginning? 2 books about the history of Germans in Louisville. We just happened to have brought some with us. And retail price is $21.99, but they're on sale today for $22. All of the proceeds of the book sales go to immigrant and refugee relief services in Louisville. Not one penny goes to Vicki and me or John or anybody else, or Carl Kramer, anybody else who participated in this project. We had 30 authors involved in the writing of these 2 books, different people writing different chapters. And as I said, many of the elements of what I've talked about here today have to do with Bloody Monday, so you may be interested. They are $22 a piece, and I have some with me. So at that, are there any questions from anybody? John's running away. John gets to answer the hard questions. Carl.
Bob, I think you could at least consider expanding, in terms of causes, the role of slavery itself, because during that period, the Whigs especially, is in an effort to try to divert the issue,
John has a theory.
backed up the nativist movement. It
Yes.
didn't work, but that, which meant, you know, that
Yeah.
they collapsed.
Yeah, I know
But,
about that.
There was this movement to divert attention from slavery to nativism.
Carl, I think you're right on the mark. If you were around in 1855, the issue wasn't immigration, the issue was slavery. And we're only, 6 years away from the Civil War, 5 years from secession. So everybody was talking about that. My theory is that George Prentice, probably the greatest newspaper editor in the United States, the great friend of Abraham Lincoln, who thought he was the greatest editor in the United States, was concerned about slavery and the disunion. He was a loyalist. He wanted to see the Union stay together. I think Prentice and others among the know-nothing tried to divert attention away from the issue of slavery by turning it on the immigrants. And thus diverting our thought to something else in an attempt to preserve the Union. It's a crazy idea, and it didn't work, obviously. But it may be a noble idea in a sense, too, if you believe how important the preservation of the Union was. Also, the Democratic newspaper in Louisville, the Courier, Haldeman's paper, was pro-slavery. Pro-slavery. Democrat pro-slavery. Not the know-nothings.
And interestingly, Haldeman was a know-nothing before Prentice was.
Haldeman went to Nashville as soon as the Civil War broke out. Sorry.
I had another newspaper editor for you, and it was luck would have it, it's Haldeman.
Yeah.
He was the first nativist newspaper editor in Louisville.
Use the mic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Haldeman had been beating the nativist drums for about a decade before Bloody Monday. And in 1855, he expected to be, his paper to be the flagship paper for the party. And instead they went with Prentice because, as well as Dr. Kleber's pointed out, he had greater name recognition around the nation. So Haldeman really was the one that laid the roots. And then just very briefly, one thing that fascinates me about the talk today is it reminds me how complicated our history is. Along with Steve, I've been following some of the controversies over statues. And when you talk about the anti-slavery struggle, you have heroes like Lyman Beecher and his daughter Harriet Beecher Stowe, who were also anti-Catholic nativists during the 1850s, and John Marshall Harlan, the future Chief Justice, was a member of the Know Nothing Party as a young man in 1855. So if you look at people from different angles, they play different roles. Thanks.
But you cannot ignore the fact that the nativists were itching to get at the immigrants. And I think it's not just one thing. It's many things going on here. And people who want to lay the blame at the feet of Prentice, well, maybe a little bit, but not all of it, because there are many other factors that came into this. And so